Why would anyone on the left oppose wokeness or critical race theory? This is the first in a series of discussions where I try to answer this complicated question. Woke activists are fighting for the right goals: justice, tolerance, diversity, and compassion for people. But the means by which the fight is carried out matters. I believe woke activists have, in their zeal to do good, embraced a set of extreme beliefs and practices that will ultimately do more harm than good. I'm not the only person on the left who feels this way. On February 26, 2021, the New York Times published an opinion piece by Michelle Goldberg entitled "The Campaign to Cancel Wokeness," subtitled "How the Right is Trying to Cancel Critical Race Theory." Goldberg gave a shallow, unilluminating description of critical race theory and admonished the right for trying to cancel it. Goldberg said, "The right, for all its chest beating about the value of entertaining dangerous notions, is rarely interested in debating the tenets of critical race theory. It wants to eradicate them from public institutions." This last statement from Goldberg is puzzling. Many people on the right and left, including centrist or liberal Black intellectuals like Glenn Loury, John McWhorter, and Coleman Hughes, have repeatedly requested debates with critical race theorists, or race crits, to use a name they once gave themselves. The race crits refused to debate. Goldberg's article garnered about 2,000 comments, divided into New York Times picks and reader picks. The Times picks overwhelmingly agreed with Goldberg. Reader picks, in contrast, overwhelmingly disagreed and were mostly written by people self-described as left, progressive, and liberal. Here are some examples. Ms. Goldberg, it's not just the right that opposes wokeness and critical race theory. It's also longtime liberals like me, a criminal defense attorney and former ACLU member, who see it for what it is. To point fingers solely at the right is to have an enormous blind spot when it comes to the dangers of critical race theory. I'm a progressive school parent and can tell you it's not the conservative among us who are anti-free speech and critical thinking. Not only conservatives and reactionaries despise it, plenty of liberals who haven't lost their ability to reason find this new religion dubious. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it isn't just the right that opposes CRT. Critical theory should be opposed by liberals, as it is a profoundly illiberal belief system. I am not right-wing at all, but I find all the wokeness a tragedy for the intellectual fiber of the United States. I am an academic in a liberal city. My university has gone all in CRT, and the result is chilling. Anecdotally, most of my colleagues can't stand it, but none, including me, would dare speak up. We have families to feed. Casting opposition to critical race theory as a conservative or right-wing issue is incorrect. My entire social circle is left-leaning or far left, yet a majority of them see CRT as the junk science that it is. There are plenty of old-fashioned liberals and centrists who abhor CRT for its ill effects. It is the opposite of MLK's vision of colorblindness, and it does indeed run counter to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a small sample of many comments expressing similar sentiments. The full comments are listed at the end of the video for anyone wanting to read them. Just hit pause to read. Many people defending CRT don't seem to know what they're defending. They equate CRT with anti-racism and assume objection means one thing: racism. That's not true. CRT is a specific set of ideas about the fundamental nature of human social existence. It can be accepted or rejected for many reasons, having nothing to do with racism, as explained in the following letter. I sent this to the Times hoping to have it printed in the paper version, and, as expected, it wasn't printed. Dear editors, the statements of Michelle Goldberg and many online commenters reveal their ignorance of critical race theory. One can be a liberal Democrat, acknowledge the horrors of slavery and racial oppression, admit that racism continues today, and still object to the specific set of ideas promoted by critical race theorists. The theory assumes that reality is entirely socially constructed by the powerful for the sole purpose of sustaining their hegemony. Theorist Derek Bell suggests that the notions of rationality, objectivity, truth, intellectual standards, and merit are merely forms of white oppression. Theorist Richard Delgado believes Enlightenment values are intrinsically oppressive, that domination and exclusion are implicit in the idea of democracy, and that liberal democracies are more oppressive than totalitarian regimes. Critical race theorists like Robin DiAngelo consider it acceptable to construct unfalsifiable, a priori racial theories about the malevolence of racial groups and indoctrinate those beliefs with manipulative rhetoric. DiAngelo and her acolytes are modeling this as acceptable behavior for all, including neo-Nazis and the KKK. Critical race theories believe all disparities in average outcome between racial groups are the result of deliberate oppression, an unfounded belief that reinforces racist stereotypes of Jews and Asians. Finally, sane, intelligent, liberal people have leveled these exact complaints against critical race theorists for nearly 30 years. Everyone should be against racism and critical race theory. Racism can be fought more effectively without this extreme, incoherent, divisive theory. This is a decent overview of some of the problems with CRT. The rest of this discussion focuses on explaining two basic issues that serve as a good starting point for anyone trying to learn more about CRT. Note, I frequently refer to this lady, Robin DiAngelo, and the ideas presented in her book White Fragility because her work is well known and represents a particularly egregious authoritarian form of CRT. Issue number 1. The academic departments responsible for woke theory and CRT are not committed to the scientific method or to formal reasoning, that is, logically valid arguments. Both formal reasoning and the scientific method are intellectual standards that provide methods to separate truth from falsehood. To be beholden to logic or the scientific method is, in essence, to be committed to the rigorous reduction of error. Any academic discipline that makes specific claims about human behavior and social phenomena should be committed to this goal. Theorists should try as best they can to determine where they might be wrong. Their methodology should include rational constraints on theorizing and/or experimenting that are designed to reduce error. Woke theorists have never honored this commitment. In fact, they view the demand for such constraints as white male oppression. 30 or so years ago, these theorists decided what's true and who their enemies are. They put their foot on the gas, said go, and never looked back. So what are their theories based on? In a word, ideology. Though the content of woke theories does not always line up perfectly with Marxist thought, their style of theorizing shares some commonalities. Marxist theory is a complicated blend of genuine, empirically based economic analysis, pseudoscience, and ideology, or myth. Woke thought inherits from Marx certain characteristics of ideological thinking. What is ideological thinking? Volumes have been written about this. I'll give a crude sketch with the 3 following quotes. An ideology is a complex of ideas or notions which represents itself to the thinker as an absolute truth for the interpretation of the world and his situation in it. Ideological thinking is normative thinking so sure of its own rightness as to be intolerant of dissent. What is an ideology? The intellectual dispensation consists of retaining only facts favorable to the thesis one is defending, even, if necessary, inventing them, and of denying, omitting, or forgetting others to keep them from being known. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt says, ideological thinking becomes emancipated from the reality we perceive with our 5 senses, and insists on a truer reality concealed behind all perceptible things, dominating them from this place of concealment and requiring a 6th sense that enables us to become aware of it. The 6th sense is provided by precisely the ideology, the particular ideological indoctrination which is taught by the educational institutions established exclusively for this purpose, to train the political soldiers in the Ordensburgen of the Nazis or the schools of the Comintern and the Cominform. Ideological thinking starts from an axiomatically accepted premise, deducing everything else from it. The woke also inherit some of Marx's ideological tenets in a revamped form. For example, Marx believed human existence is a constant struggle between oppressors and the oppressed. For Marx, the struggle was class-based. The woke take this basic idea as given, but for them the struggle is between races, sexes, genders, and so on. Both Marx and the woke begin with the axiomatically accepted premise that society is dominated by hidden structures of power which must be exposed and abolished. Both begin with vastly oversimplified assumptions and then interpret human social existence through that narrow, distorted lens. They start with a theory. The theory tells them how to interpret social phenomena. They then find, in reality, exactly what the theory says must exist. CRT starts with absolute faith in the Marxist verity that human existence is a struggle of oppressors and the oppressed, in this case whites and blacks, and then finds so-called facts to fit the theory. So, even though many people in the US abhor racism, and the general population is far less racist than they once were, the entire white population is now construed as unconsciously racist. Even though laws have been written to ensure equality, racism is now systemic, which means it is hidden so deep in the fabric of society that no one can see it. Racism was once expressed overtly. It is now silent and unstated. Whiteness, Robin DiAngelo says, includes a set of cultural practices that are not recognized by white people. Much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its invisibility. Do you see the pattern here? Much of the crucial supporting evidence is hidden and invisible. It is Hannah Arendt's truer reality concealed behind all perceptible things. To be woke is to have the sixth sense provided by the ideology that is taught by the educational institutions. Is racism as bad or worse than ever? Or have woke activists simply found a way to describe and/or invent a truer reality behind all perceptible things that supports an oppressor versus oppressed narrative? Rejecting CRT is not denying that racism exists, but it is rejecting this kind of theorizing about race. What's so bad about this kind of theorizing? CRT comes to its conclusions not by compiling data or conducting experiments, but by means of a priori or armchair reasoning. Theorists say to themselves, given the history of human life and certain features of human existence, it must be the case that the nature of a certain race of people is X, where X is a specific set of characteristics. Since it must be true, all members of the group must have that set of characteristics, regardless of their outward behavior. Rather than observing a wide variety of behavior from members of a race and drawing conclusions, the theory tells you the nature of that race and that all varieties of behavior should really be interpreted in the same way, as evidence of some basic malignancy. The theory tells you how to see a race's true essence. After being taught the theory, especially by avid devotees, it is very difficult to see anything but the theory reflected back to you. Even if some member of the race is apparently engaging in decent, innocuous, or admirable behavior, the theory inserts itself and reinterprets all behavior as, for example, phony, self-serving, and calculated, or in some way consistent with that race's presumed malignancy. Theories of this kind are the very heart of racism. After a certain amount of indoctrination, it is simply impossible for people to see a human before them. All they see is their theory. A priori theories of races and classes have had tragic, disastrous consequences for blacks in the US, for Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs in Nazi Germany, for anyone construed as bourgeois in communist regimes, and for different races, ethnicities, and religious groups across history and the globe. They should be considered unacceptable in every case. CRT teaches an a priori theory of whiteness. How is this defensible? If such theories are unfounded and dangerous, then they are in every case. It's absurd to permit one group to engage in this theorizing or to excuse or ignore them. Clearly, such theories would be vile and criminal if advanced by neo-Nazis or the KKK. Once extreme elements on the right see liberal academics using these strategies, they'll feel justified in adopting the same strategies for their own ends. We should be teaching adults, university students, and children how theories of this sort lead to catastrophe. We should teach them how to tell the difference in general between a priori theories and theories supported by empirical data. We should not, in my opinion, teach any racial theories, even those purportedly supported by empirical data. Instead, we are teaching them unfounded racial theories and creating, in both blacks and whites, the incipient stages of racial paranoia, hatred, and hysteria. If this kind of theorizing is so bad, why is it taught in universities? Over the past 30 years, academics from a variety of other disciplines have repeatedly criticized the woke for being extremists with shallow, politically driven, and often incoherent views. Woke theorists silence all critics by calling them racist, sexist, or bigoted, threatening their reputations and jobs. This is their modus operandi, and they've successfully used it to promote themselves to, frankly, an undeserved place of prominence and respectability. Their influence is largely due to emotionally manipulative tactics, not to the intellectual quality of their work. This is my speculation, but I suspect at least 50% of the faculty in every American university would agree with me, but can't do so in public for fear of losing their job. Issue number 2. Critical race theory is a narrative or ideology that is misleadingly presented as an academic theory. It is imposed on people in an authoritarian manner, as though it is absolute truth. Within every university in fields like literature, philosophy, comparative religion, and so on, there are theories discussed that are not adequately demonstrated as true by scientific methods. So this is not a fatal flaw. If CRT was simply being discussed in university classrooms and in law journals, as it has been for 30 years, most people, even those like myself who disagree, would not interfere. But race critics have stepped beyond hashing out abstract theories within the walls of academia. They're now carrying out the old Marxist diktat to combine theory with practice. They're applying a very crude version of CRT in the real world. This is another matter entirely. Robin DiAngelo's white fragility is presented in schools and corporate diversity seminars as an academic theory. The average person, seeing she's a PhD, will assume the ideas in her book and seminars have some academic credibility, that they are backed up with evidence. There is evidence of racism in the US. That much is clearly true. But the grand, sweeping, value-laden claims made by DiAngelo and her fellow travelers are axioms of an a priori theory, not empirical claims. For example, 1. All white people are invested in and collude with racism. 2. Racism is a systemic, societal, institutional, omnipresent, and epistemologically embedded phenomenon that pervades every vestige of our reality. 3. Anti-blackness is foundational to our very identities as white people. 4. The default of our current system is the reproduction of racial inequality. Our institutions were designed to reproduce racial inequality. 5. I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetrating immeasurable harm. All these statements are too broad to be validly tested by any empirical method. No scientific discipline would consider a claim about all white people to be valid unless each and every white person was carefully observed, a pragmatic impossibility. Some of these claims are not just pragmatically, but theoretically untestable. For example, how is omnipresence measured? How do you confirm or disconfirm the existence of a white collective? The notions of collective guilt and culpability alluded to in Statement 5 are flatly religious and have no place in any theory posing as academic. DiAngelo and other activists assert these statements and others as irrefutable truths. In fact, they are axioms derived from decades of a priori theorizing, starting with a Marxian myth of race struggle as a self-evident starting point. They are statements of ideology that no one is required to accept. Yet, in diversity seminars across the country, people are forced to listen to these ideas and often forbidden from objecting or even speaking. They must receive the theory as divine truth, capitulate completely, confess their sins, and agree to carry out the directives of activists forevermore. Even if the theory was well confirmed by evidence, pushing it on people in this authoritarian manner would still be entirely inappropriate. Again, there is racism in the U.S., both from individuals and from some structural problems that need to be fixed. But the ideology promoted by D'Angelo and others amplifies these problems into a full-blown paranoid fantasy where all white people are thoroughly racist to the core in a country designed solely for white ascendancy and black domination. This characterization is a Manichaean fiction. The all-or-nothing quality of the fiction elevates a set of terrestrial social problems to a transcendent struggle between good and evil. Similar race and class fictions led to paranoia, hysteria, hatred, and catastrophe in Nazi Germany and in communist regimes. Imagine if right-wing activists conducted seminars in universities and corporations where, based on Christian ideology, they shamed people with pro-choice views, called them murderers, and forced them to confess to evil. The left, I presume, would be apoplectic. I agree it would be totally inappropriate. It is equally inappropriate when the left forces their unfounded ideology down people's throats. Of course, no one should be racist, sexist, or bigoted, period. But accepting CRT goes way beyond accepting these simple moral directives. CRT makes substantive claims about the nature of knowledge, truth, objectivity, reason, liberalism, democracy, meritocracy, capitalism, and the causes of complex social phenomena. It is a whole worldview that you are expected to accept without question. Being a whole worldview, it takes time and patience to explain and to understand. This has been an introduction only, and I will continue doing my best to try to explain.